The sky above the scrapyard was gray, filled with smoke and the heavy smell of burning metal. Rust-covered machines stood like dead giants, their arms broken, their eyes empty. Among the piles of forgotten ships, broken engines, and twisted steel walked a human named Kale. He was not rich, not powerful, but his eyes always searched for something others missed. People said Kale was just a junk trader, nothing more. But deep inside, Kale believed every piece of scrap had a secret, and every ruin could be turned into power. The junkyard was silent except for the buzzing of flies and the creaking of old cranes. Kale's boots crunched against metal shards as he pushed deeper. Today was not like other days. He had heard whispers in the trade market, whispers of a deal too strange to ignore. A deal that promised more than credits, more than rust. Something alive, something dangerous. At the far end of the scrapyard stood a half-collapsed hangar. Its doors were chained, its roof broken, but strange sounds echoed from inside. Kale pushed the door open, and the smell of oil and fire rushed out. In the shadows stood a tall figure, towering over him like a living wall. It was a woman, no, more than a woman. She was a giantess, nearly twice his height, her skin marked with scars like war paint. Her eyes glowed faintly, not human, not machine, but something in between. Kale froze, his heart pounding. He had traded for engines, plasma cores, even black market weapons, but never for a living being. Yet here she was, chained to the ground with steel cuffs, her hands big enough to crush his skull. The junk dealer who owned this place stepped out of the dark, his grin sharp as broken glass. "You wanted power, Kale," the dealer said. "Well, here it is, but power comes with a price." The giantess raised her head slowly, her gaze piercing through Kale like a blade. She looked tired, angry, but behind her eyes was something else, something like hope. Kale swallowed hard. "What is she?" he asked, though he already knew she was not human. The dealer laughed. "A war relic, a soldier from battles long forgotten, the kind that can turn a wreck into a warship. Give her orders, and she'll carry your crates, guard your ship, maybe even fight your wars." Kale stepped closer, the floor shaking under the weight of her chains. The giantess shifted, testing her bonds, and the sound of metal groaned. Even bound, she looked unstoppable. "Why sell her to me?" Kale asked carefully. The dealer shrugged. "Because others are afraid of her. They see danger. But you, Kale, you see opportunity, don't you?" The words stung because they were true. Kale had always taken risks, always reached for things others feared to touch. And now he was staring at the greatest risk of his life. He looked at the giantess again. Her chest rose and fell like thunder, her fists clenched, but her eyes did not leave his. It was as if she was silently asking him a question. "Will you free me, or will you own me?" Kale's mind raced. If he walked away, he would stay the same, a small trader with nothing but rust and scraps. If he made the deal, he could gain more than power. He could change his future forever. But he also knew one wrong choice, and she could crush him before he even breathed again. The dealer held out a datapad, numbers glowing on the screen. The cost was not in credits, not in gold, but in trade. The dealer wanted Kale's last functioning ship, his only way out of the scrapyard. It was a cruel choice, his ship for the giantess, his freedom for hers. Kale's hand trembled as he stared at the datapad. Behind him, the scrapyard was silent, waiting as if the dead machines were holding their breath. The giantess spoke at last, her voice deep and raw, shaking the air like thunder. "Human," she said, "do not buy me like broken steel. Free me, and I will carry your burdens willingly." Kale's breath caught in his throat. Her words were not filled with rage, but with a strange promise. And for the first time, he saw her not as a weapon, but as a crew member, maybe even an ally. He signed the datapad with a shaking hand, sealing the deal. The chains fell with a crash, dust rising as the giantess stood tall, stretching her limbs for the first time in years. The dealer's grin widened. "She's yours now, Kale. Whether that makes you lucky or doomed, time will tell." The giantess looked down at Kale, her shadow covering him completely. She lowered her head, her voice steady. You gave up your ship for me, human. Now I will turn your wreck into a warship. Kale's heart raced. For the first time in his life, the junk trader felt he had traded not for rust, but for destiny. The scrapyard gates closed behind Kale as the giantess followed him, her heavy steps shaking the ground. The dealer's laughter still echoed in his mind, but Kale kept walking, refusing to look back. He had given away his last working ship, the only thing that kept him above the dust. Now all he had left was a wreck, a pile of rusted metal that even scavengers had ignored. And yet, with every step, Kale felt a strange fire in his chest. He was not empty. He was not broken. He had something no one else had, a giantess who had promised to stand with him. The giantess walked silently behind him, her chains gone, but her pride still heavy. Her shoulders carried years of war, years of being treated as a weapon instead of a person. Now she was free, but freedom came with questions. She looked down at the small human before her and wondered why he had chosen her. He was not strong, not wealthy, not even respected, but he had given away everything just to release her, and that act echoed louder than any battle cry. They reached the edge of the scrapyard where Kale's wrecked ship rested. It was a shadow of what it once was, its hull broken, its wings missing, its engines half buried in dirt. Kale stood before it and let out a slow breath. This is all I have left, he said quietly. But with your help, it can fly again. The giantess stepped closer, her hands brushing against the broken hull. Her fingers traced the scars of the ship, as if she could read its story through touch. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time since her chains fell, a faint spark lit her face. This wreck has a heart, she said, her deep voice rumbling, and I can make it beat again. Kale looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her tone. You can rebuild it? He asked, not daring to hope too much. The giantess nodded slowly. I was built for war. I carried ships in a battle. I know steel. I know engines. I can make this wreck into more than a ship. I can make it into a warship. Hope filled Kale's chest, but fear also crawled in. If she truly could rebuild it, then he would have power greater than he had ever dreamed. But power always brought danger, and danger always attracted enemies. Still, he looked up at her and said, Then we rebuild, together. The giantess tilted her head, studying him. Why risk everything on me, human? She asked, her voice low. You do not know me. You do not know if I will betray you. Kale held her gaze, refusing to flinch. Because I know what it feels like to be chained, to be underestimated, to be left with nothing but scraps. And I also know that sometimes the broken things are the ones worth saving. For a moment, the air between them was silent. Then the giantess gave a slow nod, her lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. Very well, human, then let us begin. The days that followed were filled with fire, sweat, and the sound of steel. The giantess lifted broken beams as if they were feathers, carrying entire sections of the ship on her shoulders. Kale worked beside her, his hands covered in grease, his eyes shining with determination. They scavenged the scrapyard for parts, engines from fallen ships, wires from burned-out drones, even armor plates ripped from forgotten war machines. The giantess taught Kale how to shape metal with precision, how to fuse wires into veins that could carry power. She was patient, though her voice was always heavy with command. And Kale listened, learning more in days than he had in years of scavenging alone. At night, when the fires burned low, Kale would sit by the wreck, staring at the stars. The giantess would remain standing, her eyes scanning the horizon like a soldier who could never rest. One night, Kale asked softly, What is your name? For a long time, she did not answer, as if the word was buried under years of silence. Finally, she said, They called me Ithra in the old wars. Kale repeated the name slowly, letting it settle in his chest like a promise. Ithra, he whispered. Then from now on, you are not a weapon, you are my crew. Ithra's eyes softened, just for a heartbeat. before the steel returned. "You are bold, human," she said, "but boldness alone does not win wars. Remember that." As days turned into weeks, the wreck began to change. What was once rusted and dead now glimmered with new strength. Engines roared back to life. Armor plates shone under the sun. And for the first time in years, Cale felt the future opening before him. But in the shadows of the scrapyard, eyes were watching. Other traders, other scavengers, men who whispered that Cale had bought something dangerous, something too powerful to be left unchecked. And while Cale and Ithra built their warship, enemies began to gather, sharpening their knives in the dark. The warship rose slowly from the ground, its frame no longer broken, but shaped with new strength. Cale wiped the sweat from his face, his hands stained with oil, and looked at the work they had done. The engines hummed with life. The armor glowed faintly under the sun, and even the old cockpit flickered with power. It was not finished, but it was no longer a grave. It was becoming something greater. Beside him, Ithra stood tall, her massive arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning every bolt and wire. She never allowed mistakes, never accepted weakness. Yet Cale could feel her trust growing, piece by piece. But the scrapyard was no longer silent. Others had seen the smoke. Others had heard the roar of engines that should have been dead. Rumors spread through the market like fire on dry wood. "The junk trader is building a warship," they whispered. "He has a Giantess soldier by his side." Some laughed at the idea, but others did not, and in their silence there was hunger. One evening, as the last light faded, Cale walked through the scrapyard to gather more parts. The shadows seemed heavier than before, the silence too sharp. He bent to lift a broken drone wing when he felt eyes on him. From the corners of the rust piles, shapes moved, men stepping out with blades in their hands and greed in their eyes. Their leader, a tall scavenger with a scar across his cheek, smiled coldly. "You've built something that doesn't belong to you, Junkrat," he said. "Hand over the Giantess, and maybe we'll let you live." Cale's chest tightened, his hands trembling slightly, but he forced his voice to stay firm. "She's not for trade," he said, "and neither is the ship." The men laughed, the sound harsh, echoing off the walls of broken machines. "You think you can keep power in this yard?" the scarred man sneered. "Power belongs to those strong enough to take it." Before Cale could reply, the ground shook with heavy steps. Ithra appeared from the shadows, her massive form towering over the scavengers, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The men froze, their blades trembling as they looked up at her. Ithra's voice was calm but filled with thunder. "You dare threaten what is mine to protect?" The leader tried to steady himself, but his voice cracked. "She's chained to you, Junkrat. You can't control her forever." Cale stepped forward, standing between Ithra and the scavengers. "She's not chained to me," he said firmly. "She's my crew, and she chooses where she stands." For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then Ithra moved, fast and terrifying. Her hand closed around one of the scavenger's blades, crushing the steel as if it were paper. The men staggered back, fear breaking through their greed. "Go," she said, her voice deep and final, "or the scrapyard will be your grave." The scavengers fled into the night, their footsteps fading, leaving only dust behind. Cale turned to Ithra, his breath heavy. "You didn't have to," he began, but she cut him off. "I did," she said, her tone sharp, "because weakness invites predators, and you cannot afford weakness if you want this ship to rise." Cale nodded slowly, her words burning deep inside him. She was right. This was no longer just about survival. It was about power, and power drew enemies. But he also knew one thing. Ithra had chosen to stand by him, not because of chains, but because of choice, and that meant more than steel. The next day, Cale worked harder than ever, his hands bleeding, his eyes burning with determination. Every sound of the hammer, every spark of fire was a promise that he would not bow. Ithra watched him silently, sometimes helping, sometimes teaching, and sometimes only standing guard. She knew what he did not yet understand. that building a warship was not only about engines and armor, but about will. A ship could not fly if its captain's heart was weak. At night, when Kale rested against the half-built hull, he asked her quietly, "Why do you stay with me, Ithra? You could have walked away the moment your chains broke." Her glowing eyes softened for a brief moment. "I stay," she said, "because you did not see me as a weapon. You saw me as a crew, and no warship flies without loyalty." Kale felt something shift in his chest at her words. Not fear, not power, but a bond stronger than any trade. He did not say it aloud, but he knew in that moment his future was no longer just his, it was theirs. Yet, far beyond the scrapyard, in the dark corners of space, other ears had caught the whispers. A warship rising from rust, a human with a giantess soldier. Old enemies stirred, factions that once ruled with fear. And soon, the scrapyard would no longer be just a place of broken machines. It would become the first battlefield. The warship was almost ready, its engines stronger, its armor shining under the harsh sun of the scrapyard. Kale and Ithra had worked for weeks, turning broken steel into something alive, something powerful. But power never stayed hidden for long. The whispers had grown louder, reaching ears far beyond the markets and traders. Mercenaries, raiders, and scavenger lords all wanted the same thing: a warship that could tip the balance of power. And so, the night came when the scrapyard stopped being quiet. Kale was tightening the last bolts on the engine core when the alarms he had set crackled. Red lights flashed across the yard, warning of movement beyond the fences. He looked up sharply, his heart racing. "Ithra," he called, and she was already there, her massive frame stepping out of the shadows, her eyes glowing with a dangerous light. "They're here," she said simply, as if she had been waiting for this moment. From the edge of the yard, dark figures emerged, armored men carrying rifles and plasma blades. Their leader, dressed in black steel, raised his hand and shouted, "Hand over the ship, Junkrat, and maybe we'll let you and your pet live." Kale felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stand tall. "She's not my pet," he shouted back, "and this ship is mine." Laughter echoed across the scrap piles, cruel and mocking. The leader's voice carried again. "Then you've chosen death." The first wave came fast, blasters firing, bullets sparking off rusted metal. Kale ducked behind a crate, firing back with the old rifle he kept hidden. His shots were wild, but Ithra did not need a weapon. With a roar, she leapt into the fray, her massive fists crashing down on the attackers. The ground shook as she moved, her strength tearing through steel like paper. Men screamed as she lifted one and threw him across the yard, another crushed under her kick. To Kale, it was like watching a storm made flesh, unstoppable and terrifying. Yet even Ithra could not fight them all. More men poured in, surrounding them, firing from every side. Kale's rifle overheated, the barrel glowing, forcing him to duck deeper behind cover. A plasma blast struck near him, the heat burning his cheek. He clenched his teeth, fear pressing against him. But when he looked up and saw Ithra standing tall, her body shielding him from fire, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt fury. "This is our ship," Kale shouted, his voice raw, "and no one will take it." He grabbed a loose cable from the engine core and yanked it free, sparks bursting in the dark. He swung it across the nearest raider, the electric shock throwing the man back screaming. It wasn't much, but it gave Ithra space to strike again, her fists smashing through the raider line. The battle raged, the scrapyard filled with smoke and fire. Kale coughed, his lungs burning, but he kept moving, grabbing tools, throwing scrap, anything that could be used as a weapon. He wasn't a soldier, but survival had always made him clever. Beside him, Ithra fought like a warrior born. Her chains of the past now turned into fury. For every man that fell, two more came, but she did not falter. Finally, the black-armored leader stepped forward, his plasma blade glowing. Ithra turned, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can command me?" she growled, her voice like thunder. The leader sneered. "You're nothing but a war relic, a weapon without orders. But Kale stepped forward before she could answer, his voice cutting the air. "She's not a relic, and she's not a weapon. She's my crew, and together we'll burn anyone who tries to chain her again." The leader charged, blade slicing through the air. Ithra met him head-on, her fist colliding with the plasma shield, sparks exploding. The sound was deafening, the clash of steel and power shaking the yard. Kale held his breath as the two giants fought, one of flesh and one of steel. At last, with a roar, Ithra drove her fist straight through his armor, sending the leader crashing into the dirt, his blade shattering in the dust. The remaining raiders froze, their courage broken. "Fall back," one shouted, and within moments, they scattered into the night, leaving only silence and smoke. Kale staggered to his feet, his chest heaving. The scrapyard was a ruin of fire and broken bodies, but the ship still stood, and so did they. Ithra looked down at him, her skin marked with burns, her breath heavy but steady. "You fought," she said, her tone carrying both respect and warning. Kale wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes burning with determination. "And I'll keep fighting," he said, "because this ship, this crew, it's worth it." Ithra gave a slow nod, her gaze sharp but approving. "Then you are ready," she said. "But this was only the beginning. More will come, and they will not stop until either we fall or we rise above them." Kale turned to the half-built warship, its engines glowing faintly in the smoke. His fists clenched, his heart steady. "Then let them come," he whispered, "because we're not done yet." The scrapyard still smelled of smoke, but silence now ruled where fire had raged. Kale stood among the ruins, his chest aching from the fight, his hands still trembling. Ithra towered beside him, her massive form dark against the faint glow of the warship's engines. They had survived, but survival was no longer enough. The raiders had proven one thing. Whispers of power would never stop. Enemies would never rest. If they stayed grounded, they would be hunted until the last breath. The only answer was flight. Kale touched the ship's hull, the metal warm under his palm. "We finish it now," he said quietly, his voice more promise than command. Ithra's glowing eyes turned toward him, and she gave a single, steady nod. "Then the skies will judge if we are worthy," she said. For 3 days and 3 nights, they worked without pause. Every wire, every bolt, every scar of the wreck was reforged under their hands. Kale's body burned with exhaustion, but his mind burned hotter with determination. Ithra carried the heaviest beams, lifted engines into place, sealed the armor with strength no machine could match. At times, when Kale faltered, she would glance down at him, her sharp voice pushing him forward. "Do not stop now. Human, destiny does not wait." On the 4th night, the warship was ready. Its frame stood proud against the horizon, armor plates gleaming like the scales of a sleeping beast. The engines, once silent, now pulsed with a deep, steady hum. The cockpit lights glowed, waiting for a pilot, waiting for Kale. He climbed inside, the seat worn but alive with new power. The controls hummed under his touch. The screen flickered with green light. For the first time, the wreck felt not like a grave, but like a living creature ready to breathe. Ithra stood outside, her massive hand pressed against the hull, her voice low. "This is no longer a ship of rust. It is a warship. But remember, Kale, a ship is only as strong as the one who commands it." Kale gripped the controls, his heart hammering in his chest. He activated the ignition, and the engines roared like thunder. The ground shook, dust rising in waves, the scrapyard trembling as if the dead machines were waking. Lights flared across the panels, warnings blaring, but Kale pushed forward. The warship groaned, metal screaming, then lifted an inch, then 2. His breath caught as the scrapyard fell away beneath him. Ithra leapt, landing on the deck with the grace of a warrior, despite her size. She braced herself as the ship rose higher, the chains of the ground breaking with every second. Kale shouted over the roar, half in fear, half in triumph. It's flying. The warship shuddered, engines straining, but it did not fall. It climbed, slow but steady, breaking free of the dust and rust, rising into the open sky. For Cale, the moment was more than flight. It was freedom. It was proof that he was no longer just a trader of scraps. He was a captain, and this was his ship, his crew, his future. He looked at Ethra through the cockpit glass, her stance strong, her gaze unshaken. She had chosen to stay, and together they had done the impossible. But even as triumph filled the air, danger followed. On the horizon, dark shapes moved, ships glinting under the pale sun. Cale's smile faded as the sensors blared with warning. Raiders again, but larger this time, better armed, drawn by the roar of a warship's birth. Ethra's voice cut through the alarm, steady and sharp. They come, human, and they will not let us rise without a fight. Cale tightened his grip on the controls, the glow of the enemy ships reflected in his eyes. Then we'll give them one, he said. The warship's guns, rebuilt from rust and scavenged steel, shifted into place, targeting systems flickering alive. The engines steadied, the wings spread, and the ship was no longer a wreck. It was a beast of war, and it was ready to roar. As the raiders closed in, Ethra's hand rested on the metal beside her, her deep voice carrying a single truth. This is the moment, Cale. Either we fall back into rust, or we rise in a legend. Cale's heart pounded, his voice fierce. Then let's rise. And with a surge of power, the warship turned toward the oncoming enemy, its cannons glowing, its engines blazing. The first battle of the skies had begun. The warship's engines howled as it climbed higher, the scrapyard shrinking below into shadows and dust. Cale's hands gripped the controls tightly, his pulse racing with every tremor of the ship. Ethra stood on the deck, her stance steady despite the violent shake of the engines, her eyes fixed on the horizon. And there, cutting through the pale sky, came the enemy. 5 raider ships, sleek and armed, wings glinting with plasma cannons. They spread into formation, surrounding Cale's newborn warship like wolves circling prey. The sensors screamed warnings, red lights flashing across the panels. Cale forced his breath steady, his voice low. They want to scare us, keep us from fighting back. Ethra's deep voice carried into the cockpit, steady as iron. Then show them you're not prey. The first volley came, plasma bolts streaking through the sky, lighting the clouds with fire. The warship shook violently, alarms crying out, sparks bursting from the panels. Cale clenched his teeth and pulled the ship into a sharp dive, the engines roaring under the strain. The shots missed, exploding against empty sky. For a moment, Cale almost laughed with disbelief. We dodged them, he muttered, but Ethra's voice cut in sharp. Do not celebrate, strike back. Cale's hands flew across the controls, his fingers hitting switches. The scavenged cannons hummed, targeting systems locking on. Let's see if you work, Cale whispered, then pulled the trigger. The warship's guns roared, fire cutting across the sky. One raider swerved too late, flames bursting from its wing before it spiraled down in smoke. Cale's chest tightened with wild joy. We got one. The other raiders screamed back with fury, unleashing another barrage. Bolts ripped past, one striking the hull with a deafening blast, the ship lurching to the side. Cale slammed against the seat, alarms howling louder. We can't take many more hits, he hissed, struggling to hold the ship steady. Ethra braced against the deck, her massive hands gripping the hull. Then fly not as a traitor, Cale. Fly as a warrior, she growled. The words cut into him, steadying his shaking hands. He pulled the ship into a sudden climb, the engines screaming in protest. The raiders followed, their fire cutting trails of fire across the sky. At the peak of the climb, Cale spun the ship hard, flipping it in a full arc. The warship roared as it dove back down, its cannons firing into the pack below. Another raider exploded in flames, debris scattering like falling stars. But one slipped close, almost too close, its cannons charging bright. Cale's eyes widened. They're going to hit us. Before he could react, Ithra leapt from the deck, her massive body landing on the enemy's wing with earth-shaking force. The raider tilted violently, its pilot screaming as Ithra ripped the cannon from its side and hurled it into the sky. With one final strike, she crushed the cockpit, sending the ship crashing in fire. Cale stared in shock as she leapt back onto their own warship, landing with a heavy thud. You just destroyed a ship with your hands, he stammered. Ithra's eyes glowed faintly. I told you, human, I was built for war. Only 2 raiders remained, circling cautiously now. Cale's breath came fast, sweat dripping into his eyes. He felt the ship's heart beating with his own, every engine pulsed like blood through veins. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward. No more running, he said. We finished this. The last 2 raiders moved in together, their cannons blazing. Cale twisted the ship low, skimming the clouds, fire streaking behind them. The cannons hummed again, his fingers steady this time. Come on, he muttered, pulling the trigger. The warship spat fire, catching one raider full in the chest, flames bursting wide. The last enemy screamed into the comms, then turned to flee. Cale hesitated only a second before firing again. The shot cut the sky, striking the raiders' engines. The ship spun, then vanished in a fire and smoke. Silence followed, broken only by the hum of their own engines. Cale slumped back into the seat, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. Ithra stepped into the cockpit, her massive frame filling the doorway. You fought like a captain, she said, her tone sharp but carrying pride. Cale looked at her, a weak smile on his lips. We're still alive. She nodded slowly, her voice low, alive and rising. Outside the window, the open sky stretched wide, endless and dangerous. Cale stared at it, his eyes burning with something new. He was no longer just a junk trader, no longer a man tied to rust. He was a captain of a warship with a Giantess as his crew, and together they had survived their first true battle. But deep in space, far beyond their sight, other signals stirred. Fleets that once ruled, factions that feared nothing but power. The whispers of a human and a Giantess rebuilding war had spread farther than Cale imagined. And soon, their fight would not just be for survival, but for the fate of worlds. The warship drifted in the quiet sky, smoke still trailing from its scorched wings. Cale sat in the cockpit, his hands heavy, his body aching, yet his eyes burned with a fire that had not been there before. Ithra stood behind him, silent, her glowing eyes fixed on the stars. They had survived the raiders, they had risen from the scrapyard into the sky, but the silence carried no peace. For silence in a void always meant something was coming. The ship's sensors flickered, lights flashing red across the panel. Cale leaned forward, his heart sinking. The screen lit up with shapes, dozens, no, hundreds. A full fleet, their signals strong, their weapons locked. Ithra's voice was steady, though heavy with the weight of truth. The factions have heard. Human, they will not allow us to keep what we have built. They come to erase us. Cale's throat went dry, his fingers trembling on the controls. We can't fight a fleet, he whispered, but Ithra placed her massive hand on the hull, her voice calm and firm. Perhaps not, but we do not run. A warship that hides is no warship at all. Her words struck deep, cutting through the fear that clawed inside him. He looked at her, the Giantess who had once been chained, who had chosen to stay, and he knew running was not an option. The first fleet ships broke through the clouds, their guns glowing, their shadows vast across the sky. Cale's warship shuddered, small against them, yet alive with defiance. Then we fight, Cale said, his voice steady now. Ithra gave a slow nod, pride in her glowing eyes. Yes, Captain, we fight. The sky erupted, fire and steel clashing in endless waves. Bolts of plasma cut the clouds. Explosions shook the heavens. Cale twisted the ship through gaps that should have been impossible, his hands moving with instinct born of desperation. Every time he faltered, Aethra's voice grounded him. "Steady, Kale, do not fear the fire, become the fire." The warship roared, its cannons blazing, tearing through enemy wings. One by one, ships fell, crashing in flames. Yet still the fleet pressed in. Inside the cockpit, alarm screamed, smoke filled the air. Kale coughed, sweat stinging his eyes, his body shaking. But when he looked out and saw Aethra holding her ground on the deck, her massive form unyielding, he felt strength surge again. She was his anchor, his crew, his proof that he was not alone. Together, they struck back again and again, until the sky itself seemed to burn. At the heart of the fleet came a massive dreadnought, its shadow covering the stars. It was larger than anything Kale had ever seen, a beast of war built to crush worlds. His chest tightened as its cannons charged, brighter than suns. This we can't survive," he muttered, but Aethra's voice cut sharp. "Do not surrender, Kale. One strike can change the course of a battle. One spark can turn rust into fire." Her words struck him like lightning. Kale's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening. "Then let's make that spark," he said. He drove the warship forward, engines screaming at their limit. The dreadnought's cannons fired, a storm of fire splitting the sky. The warship twisted, burning, armor peeling, yet it did not fall. Kale pushed harder, every nerve screaming, his voice raw. "Hold together, just a little more." Aethra braced herself, her fists slamming into the hull as if lending it her own strength. The ship roared, diving straight into the storm. With a final surge, Kale fired all cannons at once. The blasts tore into the dreadnought's core, fire erupting in a chain of explosions. The massive ship split apart, its shadow torn into flames, falling in burning pieces across the sky. The fleet faltered, their formation broken, their courage shattered. One by one, they turned, retreating into the dark, leaving silence in their wake. Kale slumped in his seat, his breath ragged, his body numb. But when he looked at Aethra, she was smiling, small, faint, but real. "You fought as more than a junk trader," she said, her deep voice carrying pride. "You fought as a captain." Kale let out a weak laugh, his eyes on the smoking sky. "And we fought as a crew," he said. The warship drifted through the quiet, scarred and burning, but alive. From rust and chains, it had risen into legend. Kale was no longer a traitor, no longer a man forgotten among scraps. He was captain of a warship with a giantess by his side, and together they had written the first line of a story that the stars would never forget.